Hi, I'm Carol Anne McChrystal, and I'm recording this talk as a sort of closing event for my show with Mata Art Gallery called ENTROPICAL Latitudes, which runs from March 13th to June 20th, 2021. I'm really happy to be able to share a little bit about my practice today, and I want to also thank Mata Art Gallery for offering me the opportunity not only to show my work, but in supporting me in reflecting on the work and my creative process in so many ways over the course of my exhibition there. Before I start, I also want to briefly acknowledge that I'm placed both here in Los Angeles, the unceded lands of the Tongva people, as well as in the Mojave Desert on the unceded lands of the Kawayaso people. For the most part, I'll be speaking chronologically about how I got to where I am now with the work. The story of my work now actually starts with the work I did in the collaborative practice Nightmare City. This was a project that I shared with another artist, Katura Cummings, which we started in 2008, shortly after we had both finished our MFA programs. We were both really interested in the way that technology always betrays its age, and that while media may present itself as neutral at the time that it is created, you can always see the signature aesthetic of that time period when you look back at those images. Just think about how when you look at movies made in the 1950s, 1970s, or the 2000s, they all have a specific look that's all their own, whether that's in the graininess or the aspect ratio, those kinds of things. Today, it's really easy to apply filters in post-production that approximate these kind of aesthetics, but what we were interested in was in getting to the root of those aesthetics, in considering how the technology itself, from the film to the lenses down to the camera, and how it's built, actually create a parameter for legibility in those images. It's a function or product of the media technology itself. We got into using a lot of different kinds of cameras in our practice, like cameras that were used in the 1970s for direct-to-TV broadcasting, or spy cams that were bought from the Home Shopping Network. And we paired those with the consumer-grade HD cameras that were just starting to be available on the market at that time. We did this in order to create a look for our video projects that wasn't really up to us, but came more from what the camera itself was capable of creating. We would take the footage we shot on these cameras and we would scan them and rescan them from digital to analog and back again to digital. Here you're looking at a piece called Sapphire and Steel, in which we reenacted an entire story arc of a 1970s British supernatural science fiction detective show. We took the footage that we had shot on mini DV, and after editing it, we uploaded it in 1 hour segments to YouTube. We then reshot the videos playing in the YouTube interface onto HD video by literally just pointing the camera at the streaming video display on a laptop screen. We then logged and exported that footage into its final analog format, the obsolete Betamax cassette, which you can see stacked up here. If you don't know, Betamax was the main competitor to VHS when at-home video technology had just been released. Our project focused on asking questions about the ideas of obsolescence, as it also sought to physicalize video practice. As we were asking questions about the way in which digital media and moving images were sometimes viewed as one of the last stops along the way on art's journey into dematerialization. We extended this practice of physicalizing the immaterial moving image in the way that we displayed our images as well. For example, we sometimes projected onto freestanding chameleon scrims, which actually let the image kind of bleed through, just catching the image mid-projection but not fully intercepting it. Working on projects like this really grounded my understanding of the digital world of one of entrenched materiality. All this to say that it was with Nightmare City that I first really began to work with plastics. In 2012, Katura and I moved to Germany to attend a residency and to work on an exhibition that we would have there the following year. The exhibition premise itself is enough for an entirely separate talk, but what's important is that at some point along the way, we had begun making these inflatable objects inspired by the work of the 1960s collaborative group Ant Farm. Our versions were made entirely from these colorful plastic bags that were really common to see in the €1 stores around Berlin. We were using the inflatable objects as props to interact with for site-specific performances, which was tied to the concept of the piece. At the time, plastic bags were important to us because of their relationship to the ocean, to the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. And this experience really helped me to make the connection to deep time even beyond that of the everlasting life of plastic. We often found ourselves in the middle of nowhere shooting these videos of our performances and figuring out the logistics for inflating these objects out in the world away from the convenience of electrical outlets was always challenging. I remember sitting for hours one day waiting for one of these objects to inflate, and we were using a small fan that was powered through the 12-volt USB power socket in the car. It would have been hard not to recognize how absurd this scenario was, using a car to process the energy of extracted and refined petroleum 50 million years in the making, just to power the tiny USB fan to fill this other object with air, and other object also being made from extracted oil. While this scenario was kind of funny, what really struck me as truly absurd was in the expansion of these relationships outward. Once you think about it, it's really impossible to unsee the absurdity in how much we rely on deep time extraction for every aspect of our contemporary digital lives. This image is from a later iteration of the piece that we shot in Joshua Tree. By this time, several years later, we had figured things out a little bit more, and we were using a generator to inflate the objects, but I still think that the absurdity of the scenario applies. The resulting works became more sculptural in nature. They were made from concrete poured into plastic bags that were stacked into molds to create these sort of plinths for the videos. These sculptures were sort of cradles for first-generation iPads and iPhones that displayed the short loops from these on-site performances. Viewers could look into the viewfinder at the top of each sculpture and see the videos reflected in this sort of manual kaleidoscope within. Simultaneously, we experimented with creating inflatables large enough to push at the boundaries of architectural spaces. These were structures viewers could observe from the outside, but could also get inside of. Here's an interior shot of how this object looks to a viewer from inside of the form. Continuing our work with using larger inflatables that viewers could get inside of, these later works functioned as both viewing environments as well as projection surfaces on which to catch and physicalize the so-called immaterial moving image yet again. Shortly after we completed that exhibition, we put our collaborative practice, Nightmare City, on indefinite pause to focus on our independent work. During this time, I went to the Philippines, and while this was a family visit, it was my third or fourth trip there, and it turned out to be an important moment for me. In this moment, I was really starting to understand something about my experience of life in diaspora versus the experience of homeland. Just to give you a little more context, I'm a 1.5 generation immigrant born to two immigrant parents, both from island homelands. My mom grew up in Manila and my dad grew up in Dublin, and both come from borderline poverty working class conditions, which forced both of them to seek economic stability abroad. While I spent a good amount of my childhood in Ireland, I didn't really start going back home to the Philippines until I was in my early 20s. So, working with the plastic inflatables really keyed me into how plastic waste is everywhere. And this phenomenon is really visible in the Philippines. The Philippines is an archipelago island nation, so a lot of goods are actually imported in, and that means a lot of plastic packaging. Furthermore, it's getting more known now that wealthy nations from the global north have been dumping their plastic waste or recyclables in countries like the Philippines and others throughout the rest of the global south. There's not a lot of infrastructure to cope with either kinds of plastic waste. Mostly, poor people end up sorting plastic waste in the case that anything can be reprocessed, or scavenge the waste for reusable items. These are images from places near where my family's from in the Philippines. On the left, you see the sprawling Divisoria market where my granddad worked. And on the right is the Pasig River that flows through Manila, which is choked with plastic waste in many parts. This photo is from a neighborhood called Binondo, nearby where my mom grew up. At the same time, this trip was important in bringing my consciousness closer to geology. I visited Taal Volcano for the second time. Taal is a volcano nested in a volcano whose craters were both filled with water. You might be familiar with it as it erupted really recently, just before the start of the pandemic. At the last time that I visited, it was possible to charter a boat from the mainland to the main crater, from which you could hike up and over the caldera to the lake within. This is a view from the shores of the internal lake. Taal was and is an active volcano, and there was quite a bit of thermal activity along the shores of this internal lake. The thermal energy bubbles up, and there's mineral deposits of many colors along the lake's shore. And at some point in time, there was even 3 separate lakes here, each one a different color. The water is extremely rich in elements. These elements, combined with energy coming up from the Earth's core, actually creates the conditions similar to early Earth. And because of that, I love to think of this place as a sort of primordial shore. These images are just some shots that I took on that visit to give you an idea of how colorful these mineral deposits really are up close. And here's a short video to show how visible the thermal activity is. When you walk around in this area, you need to be careful because the ground is actually boiling hot and unstable in places. And just on a side note, during the eruption in 2020, this inner lake actually vaporized, so there's no longer a substantial lake within the caldera anymore. It's just a little puddle of water. The intersection of these experiences are what really informed my early experiments when I returned to Germany and began focusing exclusively on my solo practice again for the first time in 6 or 7 years. The pivot back to individual practice was for me a return to sculpture. Even though I had studied sculpture in undergrad and grad school, I wasn't sure what I wanted my work to look like. I did know that I wanted to create a framework for my practice that included long-term viability, and that the resulting art objects should engage issues of diasporic and migrant life, as well as fold in the poetry of earth sciences. I was in my studio experimenting with concrete as a way to think about chemical processes and state change in materials. I was playing around with raw powder pigment and prisms, trying to unearth something about the relationship between color, information, technology, and extraction. I was researching tents and camping shelters in order to think about land use and concepts of home. All the while, I was so homesick for California that I had this funny practice of ordering borax online and growing crystals on everything, what I eventually came to think of as growing tiny pieces of California in my studio. I was doing a lot in the studio, but looking back on it, it was a sort of a mess. I couldn't get any of my concepts or materials to gel properly. So in the end, I didn't really finish much formal work in Berlin, but it did serve as a sort of extended percolation period that gave me the time, space, and privacy I needed to plant the right seeds so that I could hit the ground running once I decided to come back to California. During the time between when I came back to the States and before I was able to complete my first major body of work outside of Nightmare City, I found myself unexpectedly writing a book of poetry. I don't necessarily think of myself as a writer, but it is a tool that I use to move through ideas more quickly than I can when I'm making visual art. The poetry was made up of phrases I had been collecting for a number of years and saving partially on Twitter and partially in the Notes app on my phone. In the end, the poetry came together almost as a collage, and I came to think of it as a trail guide to the work that I had in progress. Entropical Latitudes also became the moniker under which I started to formulate both the book and the body of work. It's a play on words, evoking simultaneously the idea of geography, of tropics, and of entropy, or the gradual decline from order into disorder. You'll see when we go through the work that there's a certain irony or tension around this because every aspect of my work is actually extremely ordered. I was interested in a certain cohesion, so I built up these works simultaneously. Working this way means that changes in one piece could impact the decisions I made in other pieces, and because of that, even the somewhat simpler pieces, works that might have only 2 or 3 components, took longer to build up. Everything in Entropical Latitudes worked like an ecosystem. Everything was relational. The works came directly out of the material experiments and research I had done in Berlin, but now I was starting to work with silicone, combining it with microplastics and raw pigments, as well as products that you can buy off the shelf from big box stores here in the States. As I built up the works, it became apparent that I was creating a sort of lexicon of components that I could fold in or interchange between sculptures, and that these components necessarily troubled dualistic relationships. For example, between manufactured and natural, organic and inorganic, or mind and body. Whether it's in a tarp that becomes a discarded cushion, silicone and pigment that becomes a tarp, cement or volcanic ash that reverts to manufactured stone, DVD that becomes pure color, that becomes pure data, plastic that becomes organic matter. There's always a slippage or transformation occurring within the relentless materiality of these works. In the works of Entropical Latitudes, I also resolved some formal and conceptual perspectives for myself around the use of color. I began to think about color itself as a form of information that might have more power to reveal something about the nature of color itself if I let it be determined by material. For example, mica powder doesn't really have pigmentation, it's all about how it reflects light. Similar to when you look at a soap bubble or an oil slick, what you see there is simultaneously full spectrum and nothing at all, depending on which wavelengths are reflected based on how you are positioned in relationship to it. I try to use this shiftiness in color to make a viewer aware of how our eyes process color in the first place. In a similar way, I let the conventions of manufacturing and international shipping determine colors and sizes of my objects, especially with the international blue of the plastic tarp and the black or blue color of shipping blankets. The form of the domestic cushion operates in a similar way to my use of obsolete technologies like DVDs and CDs that transform into crystalline entities embedded in geode-like cement balls. Both are forms of obsolescence that speak to the feudal material reality that underscores human understandings of what it means to discard an object that no longer appears to have a use value. Everything in Entropical Latitudes works separately and together to emphasize this notion of change or transformation. This piece, Crude Method, is an arrangement of objects that store and transmit data that asks the viewer to consider: how does a dented satellite dish and a broken CD steer a rereading of volcanic ash? What kind of data is stored in ash or in rock? And what about how the ash is formed into a planter? Is it something to hold a plant? Plants themselves are a type of data in the form of DNA. And then how is the reading further steered if technologies are obsolete? The specificity of the volcanic ash mined from Mount Pinatubo in the Philippines conveys something specific about transformation here. Ash is the byproduct of the literal cooking of rocks. Plastic, of course, produced from petroleum, from tar pumped out of the ground. This piece, Ay Naku, uses a similar lexicon. Thickly poured silicone and raw powder pigment transforms into blue tarp. However, speaking more directly to the concept of diaspora, this is the first instance in which I used plastic food packaging and overtly referred to Filipino culture. The voting sticker applied to the surface asks questions about how the decisions and actions taken far away in America are directly tied to what happens in the Philippines and vice versa. Humidity-absorbing silica beads fill the instant noodle wrapper, something that is food in name only and 100% nutritionless. For me, this piece established the diasporic window that I still use when talking about the Philippines and tropicality today. Residing at the intersection of emergency shelters and recreational tents, this piece, Intention, looks like a kind of future past present tumbleweed, but it was designed to be a sort of uninhabitable shelter. Rather than creating an external frame, the tent pole struts support the structure by crossing directly through the interior space. In a function of externalization, the paracord, or elastic string that usually stays hidden within the tent pole, is here externalized in order to hold those struts in place as well as outline the icosahedral shape of the shelter. Both this sculpture and the one we'll look at next are built using principles of tensegrity. Tensegrity is a method of engineering that is related to geodesic engineering, which is a concept similarly popularized by Buckminster Fuller. Fuller described tensegrity as self-tensioning structures composed of rigid structures and cables with forces of traction and compression which form an integrated whole. This principle of using the natural forces of tension and compression in collaboration results in structures that are both quick to deploy and resilient in stability. While they may wiggle around or be blown by the wind, they always come back to their original configuration. The lone scrap of silicone tarp cover on this conceptual shelter, what's called a fly in camping terminology, leaves the shelter incomplete, further unable to perform its function as a habitable space for a person. The idea that an artwork can be necessarily unfinished became a way for me to think about how inaction against the climate tipping point, the housing affordability crisis, and our ineffective responses to natural disaster are connected. In its relentless materiality, Entropical Latitudes is also driven by the concept of home and shelter. I chose materials that look disposable but relate back to geologic timescales because what is home if not our Earth? This piece, Local Survey, was inspired by reading about the ineffective response to Super Typhoon Yolanda, which decimated the province of Leyte in the Philippines. It willfully defies notions of usefulness, and it does this not just because it collapses slowly onto itself over the course of the exhibition, evoking how structures, organic or otherwise, are also literally falling apart under their own weight. However, in this design, its ideal blueprint version of itself is actually uninhabitable. Or at least uninhabitable by a human. Here, the human, who cannot fit inside this bisected shelter and whose lifespan is too long for a structure that will only last a few weeks or days, is decentered. There's a sort of humor in a collapsing, dysfunctional by design shelter, a cosmic absurdity at play. As the sun sets on the Anthropocene, humans must reckon with the falsity of their own favorite myth, that of completion, that of achievement, and that of the satisfaction promised by our narrative forms. And for this reason, local survey and intention are shelters and sculptures that must remain necessarily unfinished. Global Quilt is the first in a series of works that are based on standard shipping blankets, objects that are pretty much pervasive in art settings, and also embody something interesting about relationships between form and function. Each of these pieces is a 30-foot long shipping blanket that I manually machine quilted with a single unending meander stitch on a full bolt of polypropylene fabric. Bringing it back to material again, polypropylene is a non-woven thermoplastic polymer, which is a sort of mix between plastic and paper. When you get down to the molecular level, it's actually crystalline in structure. It's also the second most widely produced commodity plastic after polyethylene in the form of water bottles and almost any plastic packaging. Like the Sherwin-Williams Cover the Earth logo, this fabric is everywhere. It's used to manufacture cheap tote bags, face masks, filters, diapers, in addition to shipping blankets. All this to say that it's processed from petroleum or crude oil that's been extracted and refined. The scale of these pieces is determined entirely based on how long the bolt of fabric is when I get it from the manufacturer, a dimension determined by supply chain processes as well as industry conventions that obsess about maximizing profits and minimizing global shipping costs, industrialists possessed by the unidirectional flow of capital. At the time that I finished it, the first global quilt really seemed to embody everything that I wanted from my practice, plus it had come together much faster than the rest of ENTROPICAL LATITUDES. Additionally, it enabled me to work more with my hands in a way that felt very intuitive to me. My grandmother worked to lift our family out of poverty by working as a seamstress. She taught my mom these skills, and I in turn had learned from my mom when I was a kid. Because of this, I have a strong sort of tacit knowledge around this way of making. Global Quilt also flattened all of the things I was trying to get at through the arrangement of disparate elements in a collage-like way down into a flat object, many of whose parameters were actually determined by the standards and convention of trade and commodity shipping. I knew that I wanted to work in a way that was similar to this in order to create a new body of work in which each piece would inhabit the same form but be made from slightly different materials in order to express really similar things. However, one of the things I wanted to get away from was a certain reading of the work. For some viewers, the work came off as a sort of celebration of a post-apocalyptic world without humans. Moving forward, I knew that I wanted more human labor to be palpable in the work, and that I also wanted it to address more directly the realities that extractive capitalism is creating today for real people, the poor inhabitants of the global south, specifically in my ancestral homelands. I want to stop here and share a short clip from Kidlat Tahimic's 1995 film, Why is Yellow the Middle of the Rainbow? In this clip, he's explaining to his kid what third world means. I had been familiar with Tahimic's work for a long time, but it was particularly influential for my thinking on alienation and labor as I developed this next body of work.
What means third world?
I'll tell you later. Hold it to tapagin kita. In America and Japan and Germany, it's mainly machines at work, like bulldozers, earth movers. Here, people power moves things.
world is people powered.
More muscle with less help from machines. You know, third world is a way of life, a route for surviving without wasting. Third world means more reliance on your own energy instead of artificial energy like electricity. And the more dependent you are on your own strength, this means more independence. If you chop wood by hand or if you use power saw, this affects the way you attack your bigger problems.
Third world is a way of solving problems.
Yes, third world is a way of solving problems.
So, I use this clip to ground a certain idea of resourcefulness in making or problem solving, and at the same time to acknowledge this old phrase, the third world, a phrase that carries with it connotations that communities colonized, pillaged, and destroyed by the so called first world are somehow lagging behind or inadequate. Today, you're more likely to hear terms like majority world or recovering world to remind nations of the global north that they don't represent the whole of humanity. These examples move beyond the language of empire, but come out of the same impulse we saw here to reclaim the phrase third world. A big part of Filipino culture is the value of being resourceful. Resourcefulness is defined as the ability and creativity to cope with difficulties, and it manifests in our culture as being able to make something out of nothing, especially the most random of nothings. As I mentioned previously, my mom grew up under impoverished conditions and carried this value of resourcefulness with intensity into my upbringing. Because my dad is Irish, I grew up feeling somewhat separated from the larger Filipino communities in my area, so for a long time I had no idea that our family habits of reusing whatever we could to make other things was part of a larger value system. During my times home in the Philippines, I saw these kind of repurposed objects everywhere, and it was like I found a key to a lock. In this image, you can see from left to right wall-mounted planters made from Mountain Dew bottles, garbage bins made from old tires, and a lampshade made from single-use water bottle. During the making of Entropical Latitudes, I went back to the Philippines again, probably 2 times. On one of these trips, I happened to be able to spend some time at a Mangyan community on the island of Mindoro, which is just south of Luzon. Mangyan is an umbrella term used to group together several indigenous tribes that have inhabited this particular island for more than 900 years. Today, they make a good deal of their livelihood by selling various handicrafts woven using ancestral techniques. Spending time here made visible to me an object that I had been around my entire life, but had never really seen. It's what's called a banig in some Filipino languages, or a woven sleeping mat. Similar to the way in which Nightmare City had worked to physicalize the material, the experience of witnessing this labor firsthand physicalized in both a literal and figurative way this object that had become invisible to me due to its familiarity. It was the thing that my mom had in the back of her car just in case of a picnic. Every year on our road trips to Florida, it came to the beach with us. And it was the thing we used to sit on when we were lakeside during endless family parties, watching our titas play mahjong for hours. I had grown up with this object, but at the same time, I didn't have the vocabulary to understand that it was a really specific object, an object with an extensive history and rich tradition in many Filipino cultures. Being with the Mangyan weaving community shed light for me on weaving itself as a kind of technology. An ancestral knowledge passed down from generation to generation, specifically from mother to daughter, for centuries. The series that followed is called Pasalubong Number X. Each piece in this series takes the form of the woven mat, which has its roots as much in utility as it does in beauty and aesthetics. To give you some context, for hundreds of years, banig have been made using readily available plant materials like pandan, assorted palms, and seagrass. Banig have been ubiquitous in the Philippines since pre-colonial times. In some communities, they're even considered to be the most basic form of shelter. Weaving banig is considered to be a living tradition, meaning that while it is historical, it is still also practiced today. There are a handful of masters, but it's also widely taken up as one of the few accessible forms of economic activity in coastal areas, especially in the wake of increasing and intensifying ecological disaster. Following the ethos of doing the best you can with what you've got, that is a necessary part of life in diaspora and kind of related to the third world way of problem solving that we heard about in the Kidlat Tahimik clip, I hand weave my banig inspired objects from non-traditional materials like blue tarp, single-use water bottles, discarded plastic wrappers, and other products of oil drilling. I use these materials both because they're what I've got in my urban American landscape, as well as to bring awareness to the economic stability of a migrant workforce created by that increasing and intensifying ecological disaster. Banig is woven from corner to corner as a total object, so it's not as easy to identify which of the strands are the warp and which are the weft as it might be in loom weaving. The edges are actually folded in as you weave the object on the ground, and it is dynamic full body work. You use your entire body as a loom to hold the mat down, to keep the strip taut, to apply tension on a macro and micro scale as needed. I try to reinforce this highly embodied practice of these works by describing their measurements not in standard inches or centimeters, but rather in the traditional way. Each basic size is delineated in a certain number of the weaver's feet by a certain number of the weaver's feet. For example, the single size is 4 by 8 of the weaver's feet. Actual dimensions will vary from weaver to weaver depending on what size their body is. These sizes are more like approximate measurements, just to give an idea of the proportions. As all of these works are made on the same scale, I always list a dimension of these works as 4 by 8 of the artist's feet. Each piece in the series is titled pasalubong with a number given in the order that it was made. Pasalubong is a special word in Tagalog. It technically means souvenir. So in one instance, I'm thinking about the tourism industry in the Philippines, which is one of the highest grossing industries there. I'm still in most ways a tourist when I go back to my familial homelands, but there's also a different kind of tourist that visits the Philippines and extracts something while they're there, whether that's a literal souvenir of an indigenous handicraft, a supposedly authentic cultural or natural experience, or in the more extreme but still very real, exploitation of local women in the sex tourism industry. At the same time, a pasalubong can also be a special kind of gift that is given because a Filipino is returning back to the Philippines. The concept of return is a particularly potent one in Philippine society because of how forced migration for economic security is institutionalized. Since the 1970s, the number one grossing export of the Philippines is human labor in the form of the OFW. Overseas Filipino workers are migrant workers that reside in another country for a limited period of employment, in many cases under spurious conditions, and they do this because there aren't many economic prospects in their home country. This is the narrative that pretty much describes how my family came to be living in diaspora. For me, the concept of pasalubong can encompass so many different directions that a souvenir can travel, including who's giving the gift, who's taking the gift, and why, especially when considered in a global context. I sometimes speak about these works in the context of disappearing ancestral technologies. and obsolescence that can be attributed to extractive industries that dispossess indigenous people of their lands as well as the quality of life and way of life. Huge multinational corporations seek out these resource-rich lands for purposes of mineral extraction and mines. The wealthiest Filipino families, benefactors of the Spanish colonizers, grab land through hacienda-style farming, and deregulated private industries pollute coastal waters with impunity. Without the ability to sustain themselves with the land or the sea according to their traditions, the young people of these indigenous communities are forced to leave toward urban areas or even go abroad, and the ones who stay to fight these oppressive forces are often met with brutal violence. In this way, the ancestral knowledge of the community disappears into obsolescence with the older generation. On the flip side, climate change induced by all of this environmental destruction ironically also helps to keep the tradition of mat weaving alive. In coastal communities, deforestation of mangroves on the coastlines, paired with government failure to provide proper infrastructure, escalates the impact of these intense climate catastrophes like typhoons and super typhoons. Entire communities, mostly rural and poor to begin with, must rebuild essentially from the ground up year after year. In these scenarios, many people have little opportunity to make an income to buy basic necessities. In that space, weaving and selling mats has come to the fore as one available option. This is so common that, for better or worse, many social impact corporations have cropped up to facilitate weavers in bringing their mats to other markets further afield. As one scholar on Binig has observed, the mats can be a source of hope and a symbol of resistance. Weaving is a readily doable economic activity whenever major industries are halted by natural calamities. The people themselves send mats to disaster areas anywhere in the country, knowing full well the reassuring comfort their Binig can give any grief-stricken family. It's a lifesaver in more senses than one. Pasalubong number 7 is made from single-use plastic water bottles. Originally, I wanted to make this piece using Pure Life water bottles, which is the brand produced by the world's biggest bottler of water, Nestle, to essentially invent a bottled water market in the global south, particularly among impoverished communities. However, it's more important for me to stick to using materials that are readily accessible in my specific context. I do this in order to maintain the diasporic window I used to frame this work. So in the end, I used bottles that I collected from the 99 cents only store that was across the street from my studio. It's not necessarily important to know this to understand the work, but these 99 cents only stores represent a major component in the ecologically destructive international freight industry, which is fueled by today's global crisis of plastic overproduction. The Pasalubong series is a body of work in progress. There are just a few more versions to make here in the US. This series will finish after I integrate with a weaving community in my grandparents' province in the Philippines. The original timeline was set for 2020, but due to the pandemic, I now plan to integrate with this weaving community by 2023. As the final piece, the binding that I weave here will be made from traditional pandan leaves and dyed blue with natural dyes. It will be woven to the dimensions of a medium-sized consumer-grade American tarp, the kind that you can buy from any big box hardware store here in the States. I hope that this will somehow flip the logic of the work in a way. For me, the use of weaving in these works is a means to critique empire. It's a means to reflect on life in diaspora and to bring awareness to the ecological issues that are tied up in commodity production, shipping, and consumption both here in the global north as well as in the global south. Just one last note on Pasalubong. Before my family started taking more regular trips back to the Philippines, my mom had gone home only one time in over 20 years. On this trip, she actually brought a pasalubong back to my sister and me in the States. It was a 12-ounce jar of the famous white sands from the Philippines beaches that she had scooped up herself into a repurposed jar. Throughout our childhood, my sister and I played with this jar of sand, occasionally spilling it as we poured it from container to container. Though it has dwindled quite a bit, I still have this souvenir sand, and I think of it as a tiny thimble's worth of Philippine soil here in California. During the pandemic, it became clear to me that I needed to be in Los Angeles less on a daily basis. And because of this, I was able to move my studio out to the Mojave Desert, a place that I've visited frequently since I came back to California and that I also have family ties to. My studio is about a 30-minute drive from the Rio Tinto open pit mine where borates are extracted. This region has a long history of settler colonizers extracting resources, not limited to the famous 20-mule team that used to haul the stuff out of Death Valley by the wagon load. Tiny amount in comparison to the operation they run now. On the other hand, this mine is also one of the few available industries to offer people in the area employment, second only to military and carceral operations. This is California's largest open pit mine and the largest borate mine in the world. It's operated by the multinational Rio Tinto Corporation, and here they extract nearly half the world's borates. You can see that the operation is done on an absolutely massive scale in order to accommodate all the industries that use the borates that are extracted here. This photo was taken at the end of the facility museum tour, in which they show you a video of all the reasons why the benefits of large-scale mining outweigh the drawbacks, and explain the supposed environmentally friendly things the corporation is doing alongside their global extraction. After the video, this unabashedly sinister mechanized curtain opens up on an enormous window that perfectly frames this vista of their conquest below. I first visited this mine in 2018, and contrary to however I must have romanticized it when I was doing my homesick crystallization experiments back in Berlin, the mine is a viscerally violent hole ripped into the surface of the earth. At the same time I've been working on the Pasalubong series, I've also been working on a series of pieces that continues the experiments I started in Berlin, in which I was cultivating borax crystals as well as growing them on various surfaces. This is Media Archipelago 1, part of an ongoing series which are made up from small fragments of DVDs, copper nails, and crystallized minerals. Here it's sodium borate. With these works, I'm hoping to evoke the concept of deep time that's inherent in the media that we use, a concept related to UC Parika's writings on media geology. In this instance, repurposing an obsolete media becomes the foundation on which to grow a new landmass. In this way, I hope that there can be a kind of mental flip-flop that happens in which something that might be understood as an artifact of human knowledge production can also be tied back directly to how it even came to exist in the first place. Not only is it absurd that humans manufacture these technologies with a meaningless built-in expiration date, but we do it by extracting from our Earth a non-renewable, irreplaceable material that takes 100 million years for the Earth to produce. Reaching back to the work that I did with Nightmare City, in which we tried to physicalize the dematerialized appearance of moving images, I think that this work also works to dispel notions that our media is disappearing into some kind of fantasy cloud. To bring awareness to the fact that all the media that we use, whether obsolete or on the way to becoming obsolete, relies on these violent extractive methods, from open pits in the surface of the earth, to fracking, to oil derricks, to dredge up 50 million year old materials from deep within our earth. This is a quick video to show you how this work is activated by changes in air pressure, like wind or nearby movement. This movement causes the individual elements to fluctuate. For me, the small crystalline growths function as new land masses, which I hope to evoke by referring to them directly or naming them literally as an archipelago or a collection of islands. Perhaps a new island nation despite the diminutive scale, or a further estrangement of the supercontinent of Pangaea. This raises a question of imperialism for me. If we could just grow more land, then what would that mean for the impulse to oppress others in order to grab, take, or otherwise steal their land? This is a somewhat whimsical way to pose a question of scarcity and abundance, but I do think there's something of substance there. And these are the kind of questions I'm hoping to incite in a viewer when they look at my work. Of course, there already is an answer to the question of what happens when we can generate more land. Just to touch on it briefly, here in this corridor of sea in between the Philippines and China, China has actually been slowly terraforming the reefs here, dredging up earth from the seafloor to build up large artificial islands on which they have been positioning military bases. The corridor is rich with oil and fish, plus 30% of global shipping trade travels through here. Arguably, it seems like countries as we understand them today may be more interested in the idea of creating new landmass in the age-old interest of militarization in service of imperialism and of dominating economic activity and natural resources. So this will be the jumping off point for the work I'm currently making. Informed by the meticulously planned product-like objects on which my practice has previously been focused, I'm working towards creating looser, more unexpected, or actually entropical sculptures that combine local organic matter together with single-use plastics and mineral content. I'm combining all of the ways of working I've used in the past few years, getting back to working with the sort of lexicon in which I put together disparate elements to create meaning, while also using weaving and methods of crystallization to literally bind the sculptures together. These works take their cue from the concept of conglomeration, or the geological process by which smaller geologic bodies become collected and cemented together into a larger, singular geologic formation. As I've been building up the studies for these three-dimensional collages and discrete sculptures, I'm asking myself to consider the ways in which flat, somewhat two-dimensional objects can become voluminous, freestanding forms, or new landmasses, if you will. I'm continuing to use woven components again as a way to examine the legacies of colonialism and trade within diasporic communities. However, this body of work will take an overview perspective by engaging more rigorously with the concept of the Anthropocene geological epoch. In these future fossils or deep time artifacts, no distinction will be made between natural and manufactured materials, just as geology will make no such distinction in its records. In this way, I hope to turn inside out the logic of Global Quilt and the Pasalubong series. Instead of flattening the elements down into compact, easy to manage, fold, and ship, self-contained objects, they will be built up, cumbersome, unraveled, sprawling, and outwardly expansive. With that in mind, I would like to close this talk with a poem from my book of poetry called Crude Method. Because this potion calls for such precise amounts of vitamin D, carefully mixed with such inconsistent sprinkles of magnesium and copper, I'm developing a new system of weights and measures based on the largest glass spherule collected during the Apollo lunar landing mission. It's the first step in the long process of teaching my body to photosynthesize, with the option to grow perfectly polygonal, harvestable tissue lumps within. The next steps: place 2 bricks of carbon-neutral coal in the solar-powered oven, hit the solarium, and sneak away into middle space, are a little more open to interpretation. Running on 1 joule of visible light and a renewable dilithium crystal, sage-scented machines scavenging for fat droplets beneath the garbage of our reaction-containing container unearth 3 wedge clay tablets that effortlessly make the connection between Earthrise and sunrise, chemistry and consciousness. In the dead end of this 8-hour Google search lies a fortress of solitude grown from a single crystal body deodorant stick. I'm quoting when I say, we could fit on a 600 megabyte CD-ROM. I'm betting that's all you need to copy a person. Forget obsolete obsolescence. This is true, objective artifacting. In closing, I'd like to once again thank Mata Art Gallery for all the support. If you don't know this platform, it was founded and is directed by artist and curator Nika Aquino. It has really come to life as an online platform to promote works by BIPOC, queer, disabled, and working class emerging artists from all over the world. Mata Gallery does not exist as a for-profit platform. 100% of the artwork purchases go directly to the artists themselves, and they never require submission fees to submit artwork or proposals. I hope that you'll consider supporting Mata Art Gallery financially in order to help them keep giving artists a platform to share their work. You can donate on Venmo, PayPal, Cash App, and Zelle at the accounts listed here. Thanks again for tuning in, and don't forget to check out the show before it comes down at www.mataartgallery.org.